Welcome. I'd like to welcome my fellow panelists up and take a seat, please. We have to my left Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, Marisa Lago, henceforth known as Marisa, I've been instructed. We have Charles Henry, Distinguished Fellow of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. He's also former Energy Minister for David Cameron. Halima Croft, Managing Director and Global Head of Commodity Strategy and MENA Research at RBC Capital Markets. And Joe McGonigal, Secretary General of the International Energy Forum. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. So we're here this afternoon to talk about de-risking versus decoupling and our focus on net zero. And in short, we could just call that geopolitics. I would like to thank Landon and the Atlantic Council, not just for organizing a fantastic event, another great Global Energy Forum, but also for allowing me to, I think, host the best and most interesting panel. So that's in my personal opinion. So kudos to Landon for that. So a little bit of an intro and table setting. We all know this, so I'm really just reminding you. US and China, the two largest carbon emitters and leaders in new energy development, all at the same time. It is inarguable that their cooperation is integral to the net zero achievement. And let's get into the specifics. China, a leader in solar and EVs, critical minerals behemoth, processing, mining, controlling, also the largest carbon emitter. The US recently passed the Inflation Reduction Act, the interestingly named Inflation Reduction Act, focused on EVs and renewables, showed that the US is serious about protecting their interests, and it really shocked China. And is now the biggest fossil producer in the world, while trying to be a climate leader at the same time. And despite the apparent rapprochement at APEC in San Francisco, there's still, it's very clear that China and US are increasingly decoupling rather than de-risking. So I want to just give everyone the latest example of this. And this is something that we wrote about in Foreign Policy yesterday in a story called China Hawks Are Putting the Green Transition at Risk. And that was submitted by the Columbia University Energy Policy Center. So basically, in short, the US Treasury has announced that US EVs with Chinese battery components will not qualify for subsidies from the IRA, nor will EVs qualify for IRA incentives if they're made by companies with significant ties to the Chinese government. As I just mentioned, China absolutely dominates EV and battery production, processes more than half the world's lithium, cobalt, graphite, essential inputs. Diversifying supply chains is smart, but this piece argued that President Biden, caving into electoral political pressure and anti-Chinese rhetoric in the US, with this foreign entities of concern rule, is decoupling, not de-risking. So that's the setting for the conversation. Interesting times. I'd love to start, if I could, with you, Marisa, and I'm not going to dive in and ask you that question about that rule. But you're in trade, and you're here at COP. First time for you in this role. I'm very interested to hear a little bit about why there's a trade day, of course, at COP. Right. Why trade is so central to COP and to achieving net zero.
Well, thank you for that. This is the first time that the Department of Commerce is represented here at the Undersecretary level. It is also the largest delegation that we have ever brought from the International Trade Administration, which I have the privilege of leading. And we are here because we need to showcase US industry. As I travel around the world, I have global responsibilities, and under 2 years on the job, I've been to 23 nations. What I always hear is, one, the need to address the existential issue of climate, but also the fact that the US and US businesses are the partners of choice. Why? Because of innovation, because of reliability, because of our rule of law, because of the transparency, because of the respect for labor and the environment. I'll note that in connection with COP, the US Chamber of Commerce earlier this year led a very large trade mission focused on clean tech to the Emirates. And participating along with them was Ambassador David Thorne, who is Spec Kerry's senior advisor. We have right now here, as part of COP, the Chamber has brought a delegation, a second clean tech delegation of 150 U.S. businesses, which range from the large businesses to the most cutting-edge, innovative U.S. businesses that cover the range of different climate solutions. And so we are here to spread that message that U.S. industry is here to help the U.S. meet its commitments, but also to help nations around the world. Nations alone are not going to meet their COP commitments, their Paris commitments. It's essential that we partner with the private sector and tap into their innovation and expertise.
So public and private together working in that direction. Great to see. And one more, just to come back to the topic, de-risking versus decoupling, and our approach, the U.S. approach to supply chain resilience. How do you see these latest Treasury regulations on EVs impacting supply chains and net zero goals?
I have to say that someone who is a practitioner, not an academic, not a think tank person, loves reading articles like the research that was just done. It's an important part of our ecosystem of always pushing the boundary. But at the same time, I step back and say, let's get real. One of the beauties of the US system is that we engage in notice and comment rulemaking. This was a notice put out by the Treasury Department and asking for comment, looking for that feedback. I do think that the notion that we always need to seek the most efficient approach would suggest that we abandon our commitment to human rights, our commitment to environmental protection. That's just not in the cards.
Very good. Thank you so much, Marisa. Charles, I'd love to bring you into the conversation and get a bit of a European perspective. Last year, a critical year in energy for Europe, considering the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I'd love to hear from you a little bit about the European perspective. What happened last year? What are your learnings and takeaways?
So I think Amos Hochstein put it very well this morning, and he said the mistake wasn't to be over-reliant on Russia. The mistake is for any country to be over-reliant on a single source for its critical materials. And what we learned, and we can understand how Germany got into the situation it did. Germany had a very long-standing relationship with Russia. It was the cheapest gas available to them. The huge economic growth which Germany had seen was significantly made possible by cheap Russian gas. And because the system had worked for 50 years, there was an assumption it would go on working and there wouldn't be interruptions. And obviously that was a catastrophic error. There is a Winston Churchill quote for absolutely everything, and he said that when it comes to energy, security comes from diversity, and diversity alone. Now, he was talking 100 plus years ago about diesel for the Navy, but that is as true today about gas or about critical minerals, about all the things which we're talking about in this panel, that we've got to have a wider range of solutions and a wider range of sources. So when it comes to the sort of the subject of this panel, I don't think this is China or America or Europe. It is China and America and Europe, because the scope and the pace of the challenge which we face requires us to be developing those industries of our own. The lithium predominantly comes from South America or Australia, but it then goes to China to be processed. The European car manufacturers, they want to have that done to European standards of environmental protection, of labor protection, of company governance, and therefore they want those companies close to them. Now, that isn't a threat to China, because the Chinese will be needing their own output to meet their own growing demand in any case. So I think we need to do this in a way that represents and understands our own national interests, which drives this forward in a way that protects our industries, that brings new jobs and new industries into Europe and similarly into the United States, and that we recognize that actually the scale of the challenge which we face requires all countries to be working in the same direction. Just one thing on the Inflation Reduction Act. 2 years ago, at events like this, people were saying, come on, America, you need to do more. America comes up with a game changer, an absolutely spectacular thing. And Europe then says, that's not fair, you can't do that. And the reality is that we need to match it. We need to look at what the US administration has done and say, okay, we can do the same in Europe. We need to be doing this together.
If I could pick up on that, as you mentioned, the IRA is an odd name. We tend to think of it as the Manufacturing Renaissance Act. 2 years ago at this time, I was in Germany within days after the passage of the IRA. I was wearing asbestos long johns everywhere I was going because of the fire that was being directed at me. And again, take a breath, step back, and recognize that, to your point, we need to work with partners and allies. No one country, not even the United States, not even China, can do it alone.
Yeah.
That's such an important message.
Very good point, Marisa. And thank you, Charles, for introducing Winston Churchill into our discussion. That worked perfectly well. Localize production, build up your own industries. Halima, would be great to go to you, and I'd love to talk about Russia, the
Yes.
third largest emitter in the world.
Yes.
So this is a country the first country actually, that we've really large economy, that we've really attempted full economic decoupling from. and well, there's other examples too, but we'll say large economies.
Wow.
Has that been working, number one? Number two, how long will Russia remain an energy and economic pariah? And we're talking about a country where their president was just in Abu Dhabi
And Saudi
and
Arabia.
Riyadh yesterday.
Yeah. No, I think this is a fantastic question because I love the premise when you said a full economic decoupling. And I think, yes, we have imposed significant economic sanctions on Russia. The first time we've sanctioned a G20 central bank. But I do think that we're seeing some of the limits in terms of what we gain. Our failure to be, we're still dependent on Russia significantly when it comes to price. And when we think about the type of sanctions architecture we adopted, we did have to carve out, or the policy decision was made to have, in all of the sanctions, when we disconnected Russian banks from the SWIFT payment system, we gave carve-outs for energy transactions. When the European Union went forward with a sixth package of sanctions and included the ban on the provision of services to move Russian barrels to third markets, and all of a sudden we started thinking about, would this be a multi-million barrel disruption from the market? We made the decision that our concerns about higher inflation meant that we had to take mitigating measures. And we are 1 year into the price cap. And the price cap policy was basically sold as twofold policy. Keep the market well supplied by enabling Russian barrels to move to Asia, but also to reduce Russian revenue by setting a cap. And I would say that the verdict on this 1 year in is that it accomplished the first goal. It did mitigate the services ban by largely keeping Russian barrels on the market. In that respect, you could say it served as an Inflation Reduction Act measure. But when it comes to the Russian revenue reduction, we can just look at is Will Kennedy here from The Economist and from Bloomberg? He's not here. But if you just look at the brilliant piece that Bloomberg put out, when it comes to actually really going after Russian revenue, it has not proven to be that significant, either because Russia was able to be resilient in terms of alternative shipping arrangements, either in terms of the questions about enforcement, in terms of how rigorously we were enforcing. You sign that document that you paid at the cap. Russia has been able to still take significant volumes, in terms of what we bring in terms of revenue. And I think that is a challenge when we think about endgame for this war. And some of the critics said that if you were setting up a system where you continue to enable Russia to have access to significant revenue while providing Ukraine with weapons, that's not a short war scenario. So I do think that is something we really have to think about, is in terms of our limitations in terms of the type of sanctions we were willing to impose on Russia.
Very good point. And just for point of order, going forward, let's only refer to foreign policy content in this discussion rather than Bloomberg. But just kidding.
You have been brilliant as well.
So actually, I wanted to bring up Iran, which I think you were going to go to there, because there was a piece that you pointed out that we brought up.
Yes,
that we have published on Iran and sanctions.
A fantastic piece to read yesterday in Foreign Policy on Iran.
Mm-hmm. And how that has also been what one might characterize a fail in sanctions policy and decoupling.
Well, again, I think it's the same type of question when we think about, again, what were the constraints that policymakers believed they were facing in terms of ability to impose sanctions when we think about Iran, because yes, if we look at one of the factors in terms of potentially why we're in a lower price environment, has been that we've seen a significant rise in Iranian volume on the market. And the question that there's a big debate about in your brilliant article in Foreign Policy magazine brought up the debate is whether there has been a growth in Iranian volumes on the market because we didn't significantly enforce the sanctions that are on the books that were largely put in place by Congress, or are we unable to enforce the sanctions because of the buyers of crude from China, like teapot refineries, are seen as outside the reach of the sanctions architecture? And I think that this is a really profound debate. And we have somebody sitting in the front row, Frank Fannin, who played a really important role in enforcing sanctions on Iran in 2019 and led to a significant drop in Iranian exports. And the question is, if Frank Fannin were back in the role now, would he be able to take a significant volume of Iranian oil off? So was this something where we made a choice, or had the system of trade evolved in a way that we couldn't enforce the sanctions? And I think that is something that is a pretty rigorous debate right now. I would love to put that question to Amos on the public stage, but I think there is a view that we made a choice to a certain extent, that we decided that the inflationary impact when you had a war with Russia and concerns about supply disruption, remember we had run over $100, well over 100 in terms of price, that we could ill afford to have a really tight market. And so, there was an economic rationale for going soft on sanctions, but also if you needed to get progress potentially in terms of prisoner release, in terms of, dealing with, trying to constrain Iranian enrichment, that might have been the price to pay for that. But certainly Iran has been able to accrue more revenue, the question is, how do they use that revenue? And that's a debate that's really important now, considering the war in the region.
And now that we're at $70 a barrel as well, as we were just discussing before jumping on stage here.
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you, Halima. Joseph, Joe, let's bring you into the discussion as well. So you're Secretary General of an international organization that is designed to foster cooperation. And of course, 72 members, I believe, includes the US, includes China and Russia. Wouldn't at all, hard to talk about individual members, wouldn't ask you that. But Russia clearly, it's decoupled itself. We didn't decouple Russia, clearly by invading. But what is your understanding of the China perspective, just to get that angle, if you were to put yourself in their shoes, of all this discussion on de-risking versus decoupling, and considering the position that she clearly took, which was a little bit more amenable to softening harsh rhetoric with Biden in San Francisco?
Yeah, I mean, the IEF, as you reference, is the global home of energy dialogue. So we're solidly in the de-risking side of this equation and not on the decoupling side. And one of the things they teach you in Secretary General school is not to criticize one of your member countries. So I'm going to take off my American hat and put on my international organization Secretary General hat. But look, I think on the topic of critical minerals, for example, we view this as something. I understand countries have different priorities, policy priorities for their own, foreign policy initiatives or priorities, but we view it as, let's increase the pie of availability and resources of critical minerals, and there's a lot to put under that, including, increasing mining, creating new mines, creating mines in countries that necessarily don't want to have mines, and so just like the oil markets, have been sort of a global market, as Halima just schooled us in. But by having free trade in oil markets, we've taken people out of poverty, we've created wealth. There's been a lot of good benefits from that. So I'm nervous to hear discussions about limiting access to critical minerals because, as we all know from being here at the COP meeting, all of these very ambitious goals are going to be requiring enormous amounts of critical minerals. And I have to say, we started a critical minerals initiative this summer with the Payne Institute and the Colorado School of Mines because I get the sense in a lot of these conferences I go to, especially with policymakers, this challenge kind of gets glossed over. We can just overcome it. It's not really a problem. It's a big problem, and the demands that are necessary to meet the energy transition goals, we just don't have, not only do we not have enough of critical minerals, but we don't have enough of the, the meat and potato type of, elements to expand, generation and transmission. And so there's a lot to unpack there. I'd like to maybe, though, talk a little bit about some of the things we see on the de-risking side. We think I'm going to look more to sort of policies, and I'm thinking more about the energy transition. How do we advance the energy transition? I'm solidly in the camp of progress over perfection. I think so many previous COP meetings, I've only been to 2 other ones, and this is my 3rd one. They've been about chasing perfect solutions that are just elusive. We can't even get people to agree on where the next COP meeting is going to be, let alone these very challenging issues that we have to deal with. So my view is we need to put all the tools on the table. That's one of the things I'm excited about with the UAE presidency. They've expanded the amount of people here. There was an extensive outreach to private sector. We just heard about the companies from the US that are here, but oil companies are here. I mean, oil companies are here making big commitments on reducing emissions and reducing methane emissions. And we need these energy companies with big amounts of engineers and a platform to scale up all these new technologies. So they have to be at the table. I mean, that's essential, and I think this is a big improvement. I mean, last year was the first year they were kind of invited, but I think they were nervous about coming after being banned from the Scotland meeting. So I think this is we need to keep this going. Whatever happens next after this COP, we have to keep it going. But going back to the de-risking point, I think in order to advance the transition, we need to de-risk CCUS. We need to invest in CCUS. The IPCC declares it an essential part of the energy transition. We need to de-risk energy access and affordability to help Africa. We heard on the panel before us the excellent conversations going on there. Heathrow Airport in London consumes more energy than the entire country of Sierra Leone. And it's hard for people in the West to get their minds around these issues, but these are existential issues for if you're living in Africa. And I'm glad that the voices have been raised here. But it's not going away just because we're in the developing world or in the MENA region. I think Africa is going to still be addressing and wanting to have their voices heard. But lastly, I think we also need to de-risk high energy prices and volatility in oil and gas markets. And I say this because I'm worried that if the public starts to equate high prices and volatility with climate change or energy transition policies, we're in big trouble. At least in the United States, I know if we lose the public on something like this, you don't get a second chance to get them back. I mean, they're gone forever. So we need to keep them on board because we're going to be asking the public to do very challenging things, and that means managing the transition. If we're going to shut off one source of energy, we need to have another switch to be able to flip it up. Otherwise, prices are going to react.
So let's not let all of this friendshoring and industrial nationalization set us back decades. You must have graduated first in class at Secretary General School. You're very, very well spoken, very good at that. Undersecretary, love to, Marisa, would like to bring you back into the discussion. So let's get back to the space for cooperation with U.S., China, we'll leave Russia out of it for now, and the EU. Charles mentioned that in a second, and we'll come to Charles, you in a minute. Could you tell us a little bit about your outlook for that cooperation, how that fits in for trade, and specifically as it relates to climate change, if you could?
No, certainly. Look, as proud as we are of the generational investments that have been made in a U.S. industrial strategy, we know we can't do it alone. We shouldn't want to do it alone. We have to do it with other countries who share our values. And I think perhaps the high watermark of that is the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, where we use that as a vehicle for being able to address the cutting-edge issues of the day. I would also expand it a bit further. At the APEC meeting in San Francisco, we announced the substantial conclusion of negotiations under IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. It is commercial engagement among 14 different countries, widely varied throughout the Indo-Pacific. Significantly, they focused on a supply chain agreement, which has already been signed. We believe that it is the first multilateral supply chain agreement. But equally, in San Francisco, we announced a clean energy agreement, recognizing that we need to, in all corners of the world, be engaging proactively. Joe, if I could pick up on what you had talked about with the de-risking. You mentioned Sunnylands. I think that has to be looked at in a broader context of the engagement with China that has occurred between the US and China over the past couple of months. I'll very much focus on Secretary Raimondo's visit to China and her prior meetings and subsequent meetings with her counterpart, Wang Wentao. I would guess that very few people here would guess that I have trade experts in 80 locations around the globe. The country where I have the largest number is in China, in 5 different cities in China. I think that very few people here would be surprised, many people would be surprised to find out that in November, we gave our imprimatur to a clean tech trade mission to China with 16 US companies that visited 6 different cities and participated in Shanghai's largest international trade show. There are many aspects of our commercial relationship that don't have national security implications, and it's important that we continue to engage on those while never backing off of our national security imperative.
Excellent. And so there's tons of engagement that we assume isn't happening. That's taking place all the time. Yes. Very good to point that out. Charles, same question. You touched on this earlier. It's not US versus Europe versus China. But if you could expand on that, but also bring Russia back into the equation. I don't think there's huge dependencies other than, you pointed it out yourself, Russian divorce attorneys in London. But a little bit about your thoughts on that going forward.
So let me start with the Russia aspect. That I think if you look at how sanctions have worked, the answer is they haven't. Sanctions primarily need to punish a country. They need to act as a deterrent to other countries from bad actions. And they need to have a real impact in changing policy. And it has achieved none of those things in Russia. The Russian restaurants and shops are still busy. They're using the proceeds of their sales of oil and gas to other countries and of coal to finance their war machine, which is giving the economy a huge boost at the moment. So anybody who thinks that Russia has actually been hit hard is misunderstanding the reality of what's happening on the ground. And that means we've got to think very carefully, if we're ever in a position of needing to sanction other countries, then how do we do that in a way which is more effective? I don't see any re-engagement between the West and Russia for some time. We might go back in time after the war's over and sell, but you'd be a very brave chief executive to say to your board, I've got this great plan, I'm going to open up a plant in Russia. We're just not going to be in that, I think, for decades. On the wider aspect in terms of European engagement and collaboration, I want to take a slightly different approach, which is about how you advance technology. And that the solutions which we're going to need if we're going to meet the targets which the world has been set is going to involve the rapid acceleration of some very new technologies. And we will be able to do that more quickly if we collaborate between our universities, between our businesses, between our governments. So that's next generation nuclear. It's fusion, which is getting really to be pretty exciting, I think, now. It's carbon capture and storage. It's hydrogen. It's tidal technologies. There's a whole raft of technologies which will make a massive difference. And if we work more collectively together, then we stand a chance of being able to move it more quickly. It used to be said that it took 30 years from development to full commercialization of a new energy technology. For offshore wind, we did it in 15, from an immature startup industry to one which is now globally significant. And we've got to therefore see how we do that in other sectors, and we've got to do that through collaboration. The final point I'd make is I don't think the European car industry, certainly I don't know about the American one, has yet woken up to the challenge that China presents. That the way in which they have for years been reinventing the motor car to allow for EVs, and that we've sought to try and adapt cars. So they've got new companies which have built up entirely on the EV concept. They've looked at completely new designs and new approaches. And we're lagging behind them, but critically, we're much more expensive. And we're either going to have to go down the route of saying, okay, you can't import those cars into Europe, which will annoy our consumers because they're going to be paying a higher price, or we're going to face a real existentialist threat to our motor industry going forward.
That's a very good point. Halima, would love to bring in, we've been talking a lot about major markets around the world, US, China, Russia, EU, of course, Iran even. What about the rest of the global south and their perspective on this competition, the push to net zero? Are we even thinking about them? It seems to be the implications of those reactions are an afterthought. Would love your take on that from your experience and discussions.
I mean, one of the, I think, real accomplishments of this COP has been the fact, and Joe, you said don't let perfect be the enemy of good. I think it has been incredibly important that you have a stronger voice for developing nations. I think that the voice of the African nations has been a lot louder at this COP, intentionally, and hearing their really urgent, plea to essentially have more financial support to make the transition, and basically holding to the West to its commitments on that. And also the question about should they be able to develop their own assets? And really, I think the issue on natural gas is becoming increasingly critical, where you have African nations saying, we have this resource. You're asking us to strand this resource unless you need it because of an energy crisis in Europe. And so I think this issue on equity, particularly on issues about developing resources, is going to see something we're going to see at further COPs. And at a COP, for example, in Brazil, I think we would see similar types of debate around. So I do think this has achieved an important goal, at least from the metrics of hearing those voices. But a real challenge, and you've pointed this out in your magazine and at debates that you've hosted, in terms of, was it over 2/3 of the world live in countries that don't support the West's position on Ukraine? And I think that is a real challenge when we see Vladimir Putin come to this region, and questions about, we've failed to isolate him economically, but also, is he isolated geopolitically? Has he been able to basically build stronger ties to the BRICS? And what does that mean? I mean, we've maybe decoupled him to an extent from Europe, but he's able to strengthen his ties with the BRICS. So I think that is going to be an enormous foreign policy challenge. I mean, you can say that maybe, Western companies won't easily jump back into doing business with Russia, but entire parts of the world seem happy to.
So while we've got you ex-CIA opening up on Vladimir Putin, what is your take on this visit, and what does it represent? Is it a statement on the current Mideast conflict? Is it a statement on his cooperation and his position with a thumb in the eye of the U.S. with vis-a-vis the UAE and Saudi? I know it's early days.
Or is it all of the above as well? And we know what is the also important component of the energy factor? In the fact that we had the day one of COP also being the day one of a delayed OPEC meeting, and in terms of questions about how the messaging around that decision went, having to, I think, visit Saudi Arabia, it's not only for discussions about Israel-Hamas, about other issues, but I think it's also about cooperation in terms of oil policy management. Now, I heard another interesting theory from someone in the audience that I won't name, but is it also reaching out to people that your oligarchs who live in other parts of the world and asking them for additional financial assistance? So I think there'll be a great Foreign Policy Magazine article that I will be waiting to read in terms of assessing the reasons for this visit.
You're doing a great job, by the way.
I want to take this back from the high-level foreign policy to the practical on the ground and what we see. My responsibilities are global. I've been on one continent 4 times this year, and only one, and that's Africa. And why? Because of seeing the interest in working with U.S. businesses. Why? Because U.S. businesses hire locally. U.S. businesses work to build up the lawful technology transfer, not the theft of intellectual property, a huge difference between the two of them. A recognition for the long-term value of U.S. infrastructure when one considers operating costs and the need for replacement. And so operating on that very practical level, I have to go back to what I said earlier. Apart from the geopolitics, there is such an interest in a hunger for access to U.S. innovation. We need to address what you had said, the cost. We're more expensive, but I do think that a focus on long-term operating costs, value for money, investment in the country, in the people in the country, is something that we should not lose sight of.
And can I just make actually a geopolitical follow-up to that? One thing I would give a lot of praise to this administration is their focus on Africa in terms of, almost mentioned the deal they just did on the big infrastructure project, Angola to Tanzania. I mean, the type of engagement that we have seen of this administration in Africa, and I think what is so interesting, and I'm going to call it another publication, The Economist. I remember being at an ADSW Economist session in 2018, and I raised a whole issue about critical mineral dependence, the DRC, and I sat next to someone from the climate community who said, I don't care about the DRC, we'll solve for it. And I remember also there was a fantastic ARENA report on the geopolitics of the transition, and they talk about all the obvious climate benefits of the transition, but also said there's incredible geopolitical benefits because there's not concentration risk because everyone has access to the sun. And I think what is really important is that this administration is also focused on the energy security component of the transition and saying that the issues of concentration risk are also risks when it comes to the transition. And instead of that being a binding constraint, we try to solve for it in terms of engagement.
And it's a complex
Yes.
Jenga tower that we're working there, but I think that's a very good point. Joe, just to touch on that, on the Global South again, and the rest of your 72 country members, again, you're not speaking for them, but your perception of their perception of how this is all operating and how they are being impacted by a lot of these decisions.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think going back to the IRA, I think one of the lasting legacies of the IRA is going to be the enormous incentives for CCUS and also other technologies, clean energy technology investments, because you had the reaction in Europe. The reaction in Africa, I was in Africa Energy Week in October. It was, we need to have these when they're perfected, we need these technologies to be transferred to other parts of the world. And there's nervousness actually about that. And I'm trying to reassure ministers and countries on that topic. But there's a lot of criticism about CCUS. We hear it at this conference. But what the U.S. is doing with the IRA is making enormous strides to de-risk CCUS. And I think it's going to be a very important thing. But also on the energy technology side, you referenced the IRENA report. One of the big famous reports, maybe the famous of the energy organizations, is the IEA, and they're famous for this net zero report that they do, that everybody is aware of. But they put out another report that's not so famous that I think is really important, and that's the IEA technology report that was recently updated in December. And essentially what that report said was we can meet half of our climate goals by 2050 with renewables, with wind and solar and nuclear and hydro. And by the way, very aggressive, I think even more than tripling renewables under that scenario. So we have to do tremendous amounts more on renewables to even meet those goals. But the other half has to come from new technologies. And we mentioned CCUS. Hydrogen, we didn't really talk a lot about that, but hydrogen fits in that category. Fusion, there's some announcements here about fusion, and probably things we're not even thinking about right now. And one of the things we do at the IEF is try to urge our member countries to invest more in clean energy R&D. The US, I think, has quadrupled clean energy R&D. Different countries in Europe are doing the same, because I'm not sure it makes sense to if there's limited national funds or government funding, I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense for it to go into wind and solar deployment, because there's a lot of private capital chasing that. But in clean energy R&D, yes, companies are doing some of that and making great progress, but really game-changing technologies, I think governments have to really invest in that, and we would encourage more member countries to follow the lead of the US, and also Italy is doing a lot in this area, and the UK, of course, as well. This is really how we solve our energy transition issues.
It's technology.
Joe, if I could pick up on another tripling that shouldn't go unnoticed, which is the commitment of a number of countries here to triple their nuclear.
Yes, I agree.
The notion, not just in 2018, but I'd say 2 or 3 years ago, that there would be this recognition of the importance. And I do think an area that has us excited is SMR, the small modular reactors.
Yeah.
The level of interest that we have seen in Eastern Europe and Eurasia as a matter of energy independence is high. But I think it holds huge promise for Africa, the global south, as well.
For sure.
Because when we think about decarbonization, at some level, electricity is easier. Harder to abate industries, or if you want to get even tougher, water desalination. That is where I see the promise of this technology, which is, I think, on the cusp. The fact that NuScale, a U.S. company, received approval from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to have its SMR design included in applications for licensing and operation is a major sea change. I think the real tipping point in a positive sense will occur when the first SMR is deployed within the U.S., because that will be a signal to the rest of the world of the level of confidence that we have in this technology.
I was with the Romanian minister the other day, and they're, of course, big fans of SMRs and of that, and we're part of that announcement on nuclear. But you're right, that was one of the big things. And one other thing I just would like to plug is this Altera fund that the UAE announced. I mean, I think, I was just talking about the energy technology and clean energy R&D. This is critical. I mean, they've seeded it with $30 billion. The plan is to bring in others to get it to about $250 billion. I mean, if anybody can do it, it's Dr. Sultan. So it's some reasons I think having a CEO in charge of COP has turned out to be quite a good achievement. So I think that's not getting enough attention, this Altera fund that they've started. And I agree with you on nuclear as well.
There's clearly been a big push on nuclear and acceptance and come full circle. Charles, I wanted to come back to you on something you had mentioned earlier. It's really taking the discussion in a different direction. These discussions now and negotiations are a lot tougher. There's so many different players. You're not just dealing with a few government actors. There are a private enterprise, as Marisa was saying, different governments, the global south. Tell us a little bit about your observations in that space and how much more complex this has become.
So it used to be pretty straightforward. And looking from a UK perspective, we had a number of key partnerships in energy. And my job as minister was to maintain those relationships. So the biggest supplier of our LNG was Qatar. Mohammed al-Sadr, who was the Qatari energy minister, was a passionate fan of Manchester United. Every time they won, I sent him a text saying what a fantastic result, on the basis that one day I may need a shipment of LNG at short notice. And I then had a relationship, and I think he would send it to me. And it was very easy when it was bilateral relationships to do it. But we're now moving to a very multilateral stage. And so it'll be different countries for the lithium. It'll be Central Africa in relation to the DRC. In relation to the critical minerals is going to be different countries for different sources. And therefore, the engagement which government's going to have to put into energy diplomacy is going to become much more complicated and much more time-consuming. We can do some of that through our embassies, but actually, it's still going to require the visits by ministers. It's going to require people to build those personal relationships. Because what determines whether they pick up the phone and they help you when you need it is actually whether you put the miles in already to build that relationship. And at a time when we often think our ministers spend too much time travelling around, actually, I think we need to move in the opposite direction and to deploy them more aggressively on the world stage. Not more aggressively, more comprehensively.
Marisa, not specifically in your portfolio, but not too far from it either.
Absolutely. There is nothing like the personal relationship. There is nothing like the respect one shows by visiting a country and engaging. And where that becomes essential is when there are the inevitable frictions to have someone pick up the phone rather than assume the worst. That's such a sage observation.
Very much so. So, Halima, over to you. Just on that very same point, we're just so multipolar, polypolar now, and you visit many of these countries as well. It's such a complex Rubik's cube.
You know, and how you can turn a relationship around. Again, I think about this visit to Angola, and I think about the current head of state in Angola, and the role he had played, you know, in the Dos Santos government when we were entirely on the other side of that conflict. If we think about the Angolan war, we poured so many resources into backing UNITA, the other side. And initially after the war, that was a relationship that China really owned. I mean, China, where they pioneered the China-Africa relationship in terms of infrastructure for materials, it was in Angola. And then we saw that model sort of exported to other African nations. And the fact that you've had this incredibly successful US visit to Angola, this incredibly important infrastructure project being announced, like I think that is a huge win when it comes to the new energy diplomacy.
Great. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I would just say, too, I was talking to someone earlier, I missed the session, but was telling me about Amos Hochstein's presentation, and that he was talking about how he got involved in resolving the border dispute between Lebanon and Israel for energy development. And obviously, he had to personally get involved in that and spend a lot of time in the region. Coincidentally, we may need his services in the Western Hemisphere with Guyana and Venezuela soon, so maybe he can work his magic down there. But personal diplomacy, I think, is very important, and diplomacy by Zoom is probably on its way out now.
Indeed. Charles, we have 30 seconds.
Yeah, so I think one thing we haven't really touched on is how this region is changing and how it's emerged from perhaps under the Western shadow, is now got a confidence which is new, it's a very different set of international criteria and objectives which it's following. That's going to add complexity to it, but I think you look at the way in which they've been able to run this COP in a very effective way. People will always, I think, look back at this one as one of their favorites, because this is a city which can cope with 100,000 people and doesn't seem to have any difficulty in doing so, which Glasgow wasn't quite the same. And that it's so the excitement, I think, in this region is something where we'll see it increasingly being an important player.
The optimism in the region, I think.
And the optimism
very
as well,
important.
that can-do attitude, that drive. Fascinating discussion. I really, we came in talking about decoupling versus de-risking. We almost put that aside right away and talking about diplomacy, technology, the global south. I've learned a great deal, and I really thank you, my excellent panelists, for joining us for this discussion. Thank you so much, Marisa, Charles, Halima, Joe. Audience, please thank them.
Thank you. Thank you.